Across the kingdom, there was one female knight known as the strongest. People believed that no matter how powerful her opponent was, she had never lost a single battle. Her reputation spread far beyond the capital, reaching even the smallest villages, where tales of her victories were told with admiration. But recently, a surprising rumor began circulating. The kingdom's strongest knight was said to be leaving the order. At the Astrum Knight headquarters, Louise calmly explained the situation to Carlo. She revealed that she had been suspended from the order for the time being, leaving her with nowhere else to go. Carlo was left speechless. Out of everyone she could have asked, why him? Louise met his gaze with her usual unreadable expression before quietly making a request. She wanted him to look after her for a while. More specifically, she wanted them to live together and she wanted him to teach her what happiness feels like. Later, Carlo led Alba through the quiet halls of a large mansion. As they walked, he explained that the estate had once belonged to his grandfather, but now he was the only one living there. The mansion was so silent that the sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. Stopping in front of a pair of double doors, Carlo rested his hand on the handle and glanced at Alba. He admitted that he was still new to this, but he'd done his best to prepare a room for her. He slowly opened the door. Warm sunlight poured into the room, illuminating the neatly arranged space. Resting on top of the bed was an oversized stuffed toy. Alba quietly stepped inside. Her eyes wandered across the room before she picked up the stuffed animal, gently placed it on the table, and simply said, "I appreciate it." Carlo narrowed his eyes, looking both embarrassed and like a man who had been forced into doing something at gunpoint. He recalled his sister insisting that girls love stuffed animals, and now he couldn't help thinking that giving one to a legendary knight had been a terrible idea. Even so, he forced out a slightly awkward smile and told Alba that if she needed anything else, she only had to ask and he would get it for her right away. Before he could say anything more, Alba cut him off. She didn't need anything. With the same expressionless face, she calmly stated that as long as she had a place to sleep, she was satisfied. Everything else was unnecessary. Caught off guard by her blunt response, Carlo simply blinked before quietly replying, "Okay." 1 year later, Alba sat on her bed, tightly hugging a stuffed bear against her chest. The room had changed dramatically. The bed was now overflowing with stuffed animals, leaving barely enough space for her to sleep. Noticing yet another new plush, Carlo couldn't help asking if she had bought even more. Alba immediately narrowed her eyes and coldly replied, "Knock first." Carlo let out a helpless sigh. "I did." Despite everything, she had settled into her new life surprisingly well. One afternoon, Carlo was taking care of the flowers outside when he suddenly sensed someone standing behind him. He turned around with a smile and greeted the person. "Welcome home." The words stopped the moment he saw her. His eyes widened in surprise. "Your armor." She casually muttered that it was basically her casual wear and told him not to worry about it. Carlo stared in silence. Maybe she genuinely didn't own any normal clothes. As she started walking away, he quickly called out asking if she'd like to go shopping with him sometime. Alba didn't even look back. "No." The answer came instantly. Carlo closed his eyes, refusing to give up just yet. As they stood together, Carlo noticed Alba trying to tuck her hair behind her ear. She looked slightly annoyed by it. Without thinking much of it, he offered to tie her hair back, but as he reached out, his fingers accidentally brushed against her hand. Alba immediately pulled away. Her eyes turned icy as she snapped, "Don't touch me." Carlo froze on the spot. Crap. He had acted purely out of habit after spending so much time looking after his younger sister. Realizing his mistake, he quickly apologized, but Alba said nothing. She simply turned around and walked back toward the mansion. Just before stepping inside, she suddenly stopped. Without looking back, she quietly said that she was grateful to him, but he didn't need to fuss over her so much. Then she disappeared into the house. The door shut behind her, leaving Carlo standing there alone. She definitely hated him. At this rate, was living together really going to work? 1 year later, Carlo was busy sorting through a stack of documents when Alba suddenly appeared beside him and sat down unusually close. He blinked in surprise. "What's up?" Without a word, Alba leaned in until her face was only inches from his. At the same time, her fingers lightly grabbed the front of his shirt. "My hair." Carlo blinked. "Your hair?" For the first time, a faint hint of embarrassment flickered across her eyes, even though her expression remained as blank as ever. This time she wanted him to do it. Carlo smiled and replied, "Sure thing." Alba quietly sat still, completely obedient as he gently tied her hair. Living together was going surprisingly well. Later, Carlo was stunned when he spotted Alba covered in injuries. What happened to that injury? Avoiding his gaze, Alba casually wiped the blood from her chin and muttered that she had broken up a fight. She was rusty, so she messed up a little. Carlo stared at her in disbelief. A little? He hurried after her, insisting that they needed to treat her wounds immediately, but Alba brushed off his concern. Alba dismissed his concern without a second thought. She didn't need treatment. If she left the wound alone, it would heal on its own. Carlo looked at her as if he had just heard the most ridiculous statement imaginable. That wasn't how injuries worked. He tried to argue, but Alba simply glanced at him and calmly said she was going to take a bath first, so he should leave her alone. Her tone left absolutely no room for debate. All Carlo could do was watch helplessly as she walked away. That was a year ago. Present day. Alba stood in the kitchen wearing an apron with a giant cap printed across the front. Carlo told her to chop the vegetables. Understood. He watched her in surprise. It was rare for Alba to volunteer to help with the cooking. The knife trembled slightly in her hand as she carefully sliced the vegetables. Then, all of a sudden, she flinched. Carlo immediately looked over. "Are you okay?" Alba calmly raised her hand. Blood dripped from the tip of her finger. "I cut myself," she said. "Fix it." Carlo stood there holding a handkerchief, staring at her in complete disbelief. She had said it with such a perfectly straight face, as if she were commenting on the weather. Shaking his head, he stepped closer. "Let me see." Later that evening, Carlo quietly slipped out of the mansion, dressed in a formal suit. Just as he reached the door, he sensed a familiar presence behind him. He turned around to find Alba standing there with her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed. "Where are you going?" Startled, Carlo jumped before awkwardly scratching the back of his head. "Oh, just to a ball. It's for work." The moment she heard that, Alba's expression darkened. "Will there be women there?" Carlo gave a helpless smile. "Well, it's a ball." He admitted he wasn't exactly looking forward to it. Then he suggested that if she wanted, she could come along as well. Alba turned away without hesitation. "No." Carlo nodded. "Fair enough." Even so, he couldn't help but adding that she'd probably look great in a dress. As Carlo prepared to leave, he told Alba that he was heading out, but just as he turned around, she reached out and grabbed the back of his suit. Carlo blinked in surprise. Looking down, he found Alba staring straight into his eyes. Her grip tightened ever so slightly before she quietly muttered, "Don't let your eyes wander." Carlo gently took both of her hands in his and assured her that he would be back soon. One morning, Carlo stepped outside carrying a lamp and found Alba in the yard, practicing her swordsmanship. He watched her for a moment before asking what she was doing. Alba glanced at him and answered as if it were obvious. "You're up. It's just my morning training." "Morning?" Still half asleep, Carlo stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and a silent, no-kidding expression. For Alba, morning training meant around 3 o'clock in the morning, a time when ordinary people were still fast asleep. Not knowing what else to say, Carlo reminded her that she wasn't a knight anymore and suggested that she could afford to sleep in once in a while. Alba immediately shook her head. Her voice was filled with unwavering determination. "I must always remain strong." As she continued swinging her sword beneath the darkness before dawn, Carlo couldn't help wondering what it would actually take to make her finally rest. Present day. Alba was fast asleep, tightly hugging the very stuffed animals she had once seemed to dislike with all her heart. Slowly, her eyes opened as the delicious aroma of breakfast drifted into her room. Still half asleep, she climbed down the stairs. In the kitchen, Carlo was stirring a pot when he noticed her. With a cheerful smile, he wished her good morning and told her that breakfast would be ready soon. Right on cue, Alba let out a long yawn. Her hair was a complete mess as she slowly walked toward him, her eyes still closed. Carlo smiled and remarked that Alba still looked pretty sleepy. What he didn't realize was that she had simply followed the smell of food while still half asleep. A moment later, he placed a freshly baked cake on the table and told her that he had made it that morning, encouraging her to help herself. Once again, his sister's words echoed in his mind. Girls love sweet stuff. But when Alba made no move to touch the cake, Carlo tilted his head and asked if she wasn't a fan of sweets. Without a word, Alba quietly pushed back her chair and stood up. She thanked him for the gesture, but politely declined. Knights had no need for treats. He should eat it himself. Carlo could only stand there with a disappointed frown. He had really wanted her to enjoy it. Present day. Carlo returned home and announced that he was back as he stepped inside. At that exact moment, Alba froze with a fork halfway to her mouth. Carlo's eyes landed on the dessert in front of her. "That's the cake I made yesterday." Alba instantly stiffened. She looked at him like someone who had just been caught stealing his money instead of simply eating a cake. Instead of getting upset, Carlo smiled. He was actually glad he had baked an entire cake. Slowly, Alba slid another plate across the table. A single slice of cake rested on it. Looking at him with an unusually timid expression, she quietly said, "I saved some for you too." Carlo shook his head with a gentle smile. You can have the whole thing. Alba blinked in surprise. Really? That night, as she dreamed, she hugged the cake a little closer, treating it like something precious. Later, the two of them walked together in comfortable silence. After a while, Carlo turned toward her and asked if she wanted to go for a walk. Alba paused before asking, "Is it as your guard?" Carlo managed to convince Alba to come along for a walk. But the moment they stepped outside together, the atmosphere became incredibly tense as people couldn't help staring at them. He stole a glance at her from the corner of his eye. She really was beautiful. There was a natural dignity about her that made her stand out wherever she went. Sensing his gaze, Alba suddenly narrowed her eyes. Hey, is he looking for an opening to attack? Carlo quickly shook his head. No, absolutely not. Present day. As the warm spring air settled over the town, Carlo found himself thinking that spring had finally arrived. He looked over at Alba. She seemed a little happier. Compared to when they had first started living together, she had brightened up quite a bit. When Alba noticed him staring again, Carlo instinctively apologized. Sorry. She simply looked away and quietly remarked, You're staring. Unfortunately for Carlo, she still didn't leave any openings. Later, when he casually asked, Alba, a walk? She immediately replied, I'm ready. For a moment, Carlo couldn't help wondering, was she actually looking forward to it? As they strolled through the marketplace together, Carlo noticed something that had been happening more and more often lately. The crowd instinctively parted whenever Alba walked by. Shopkeepers who had been loudly calling out to customers suddenly lowered their voices, watching her with uneasy expressions. Curious eyes followed her from every direction, while some people silently stepped aside without saying a word. One woman even hurriedly pulled her young child closer and guided him away as Alba passed, as though an invisible pressure surrounded her. Noticing the uncomfortable atmosphere, Carlo glanced back at her. Could you stay a little closer behind me? Before Alba could answer, a passing man suddenly slammed his shoulder into Carlo. The impact made him let out a quiet groan. He turned around, expecting at least an apology, only to see the man continue walking away as if nothing had happened. Carlo's brows slowly furrowed. Something about the man's behavior immediately struck Carlo as suspicious, and he opened his mouth to point it out. But Alba was already gone. No, she was directly above him. Hovering silently in the air over the busy marketplace, Alba remained suspended for a brief moment while the unsuspecting pickpocket continued walking below, completely unaware that danger was hanging right above him. Then she dropped. She landed squarely on top of the man, effortlessly pinning him to the ground. Without the slightest hint of struggle, she pulled Carlo's wallet from the thief's pocket before calmly walking back over. Holding it out to him, she matter-of-factly explained that pickpockets were everywhere in this area and that he needed to be more careful. Carlo simply stood there. Once again, his brain seemed to have stopped working. As always, Alba had somehow found another way to leave him completely speechless. After finally collecting himself, Carlo sincerely thanked her. Unfortunately, the entire street had stopped to watch. People openly stared at them, and Carlo could practically feel their eyes drilling into him. With an awkward smile, he pointed toward the groaning man still lying on the ground. You might have overdone it, just a little. Alba folded her arms across her chest. It's not a big deal. Carlo let out a helpless sigh before gently reminding her that she wasn't acting like a knight right now. Alba looked ready to defend herself, but before she could argue, Carlo softly cut her off. Maybe next time you could hold back a little, just a little more gently, okay? For a brief moment, Alba lowered her eyes. A trace of disappointment crossed her face. Carlo noticed it immediately. Awkwardly scratching the back of his neck, he quickly changed his tone and thanked her once more. This time, he added that she had looked really cool. Alba paused. Then, in her usual flat voice, she simply replied, Yeah. On the inside, however, she couldn't help thinking that Carlo really was a strange person. First he scolded her, then he praised her. He really was weird. 1 year later, Carlo casually bought a loaf of bread from a market stall. Without warning, a man suddenly snatched it from his hands and took off running. For a moment, Carlo simply stood there. Then, an overwhelming sense of déjà vu washed over him. The very next second, while the thief was still sprinting away, Alba suddenly appeared directly in front of him. With her arms crossed and her expression as cold as ever, she calmly spoke. Hand it back. I'll let you go if you do it now. The thief froze where he stood. Without saying another word, he immediately dropped the bread and fled for his life. Carlo let out a helpless laugh before apologizing, admitting that he had let his guard down again. Alba calmly reminded him that she had already warned him not to be so careless. With a weak smile, Carlo thanked her and told her she really was amazing. He promised to be more careful from now on. Alba paused for a brief moment before matter-of-factly replying, "Well, obviously." Carlo could only smile. Turning around, Alba quietly announced that it was time to head home. Even opponents far larger and stronger than Alba had never been able to defeat her. The other knights still remember the shock of watching her effortlessly overwhelm them in battle. Yet that same fearsome knight was now quietly enjoying afternoon tea. After taking a bite of a cupcake, Alba stared at it with wide, completely unblinking eyes. Watching her reaction, Carlo smiled and gently told her that there was still more if she wanted it. Alba paused before quietly admitting that she still wasn't used to all of this. Carlo simply pointed out that she had settled in surprisingly well before asking if she wanted another cup of tea. As he picked up the teapot, he gently reminded her that taking a break every now and then was important. Just then, the kettle suddenly slipped from Carlo's fingers. Before it could even hit the ground, Alba caught it effortlessly. She glanced at him and asked, "Was that part of the break too?" Carlo immediately stepped closer and gently took her hand. Filled with concern, he asked if she was all right and whether she had burned herself, reminding her that the kettle had been extremely hot. Alba insisted that he was overreacting. Even so, Carlo continued holding her hand carefully. Genuine worry was written all over his face, as he reminded her that her hands were important, especially to someone like her. Alba lowered her eyes and looked at her own hand. Quietly, she realized that no one had ever worried about her like this before. After a brief silence, she casually remarked, "It still beats blocking a sword anyway." Carlo closed his eyes with an exasperated sigh. You can't compare those two. In the end, Alba stopped resisting and allowed him to take care of it while he carefully tended her hand.